evening, my friends. Thank you to the Reading Library for hosting tonight's program, and most of all, thank you for coming. Otherwise, I'd be speaking to an empty room. There's a wonderful scene early in the movie Amadeus. How many have seen that movie? Very famous movie, won a bevy of Academy Awards, 8, I believe, in 1984, which, if I dare say, 1984 is a great year. There's a wonderful exchange that takes place early in the film. Now, as you remember, those of you who have seen the film, not a spoiler alert, the film actually is narrated not by Mozart, but by supposedly his arch nemesis, Antonio Salieri. We'll talk a little bit about him at the end of the program. And the film actually takes place, it starts 30 years after Mozart's death. So this is in the early 1820s. And it starts with an elderly Salieri who's losing his wits and having a nervous breakdown. And they've committed him to some kind of a sanitarium, almost like an insane asylum. And he's there and he's confessing his sins to a priest. And the priest, of course, has no clue who this guy is. Salieri says, "Didn't you know? Once upon a time, I was the most celebrated composer in Europe." Fact check. Almost true. There's merit to that statement. And the priest, a young man, smiles sheepishly and he says, "I regret to say, Signore, I don't think I know your music." Salieri says, "What about this one?" And he goes to the piano and he plays a tune. And the priest, smiling awkwardly, says, "I regret to say, Signore, I don't recognize it." Salieri, experiencing a flashback to his glory days, says, "This one brought the house down." Plays another tune. And the priest responds with another awkward smile. "I regret to say it is not known to me." Salieri says, "Well, what about this one?" And he begins to play the melody of a famous Mozart string quintet known as Eine kleine Nachtmusik. Bam, 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 bam. To which the priest becomes very animated. His reaction is one of great enthusiasm, one of great excitement and alacrity. And he says, "I know that one. Oh, I didn't know you wrote that. That's wonderful. That's splendid." Salieri, grimacing, looks at the priest and says, "I didn't. That one was Mozart." It's a wonderful framing device for the flashbacks that will form the main body of the movie. Now, why is it so illuminating? Because, first of all, it rings with truth. It resonates with actual, verifiable historicity. What do I mean by that? Well, the truth is that Antonio Salieri survived Mozart, his supposed nemesis, by more than 30 years. And Salieri was half a generation older than Mozart, so he lived a very long life. And yet, we, the audience, are invited to ponder Salieri's quandary at the end of his life, where he finds himself becoming increasingly irrelevant. By the way, most composers in history became more or less irrelevant either as they approached their final days or shortly after they died. Great example of that would be the composer that we discussed in our last lecture, Johann Sebastian Bach. Remember we talked about the Brandenburg Concerti in that lecture for those who were in attendance. Those pieces were written around 1720. They were put on a shelf until nearly 1850. Mozart of Bach said the following: "He is the master, we are the students." He was talking about Johann Christian Bach. Do you know why? Because he didn't know Johann Sebastian Bach's music, because for most of music history, most composers, their repertoire died with them. And yet that starts to change. We see it with Mozart, and it's captured so elegantly in the film. Because even 30 years plus after Mozart's death, Antonio Salieri could not escape the immense shadow of a man who probably stood no more than 5'3". Mozart loomed large, and Mozart's impact basically was felt throughout musical circles in Europe, but in particular by composers who knew his works well, and Mozart became a widely studied composer shortly after his death, and that's very unusual in music history. So let's go back to 1761. Mozart is about to turn 5 years old. Now he's got an older sister who's about 5 years his senior. And his older sister is a phenomenon. She's a real virtuoso by the age of 10. She's already able to play very challenging repertoire. She's going to have a very promising youth, at least, if not a career. She's going to have a youth as a Wunderkind, as a virtuoso, as a young child prodigy. What about her younger brother? Well, Wolfgang and Nannerl, his sister, were the only two of 6 children born to Leopold and Anna Maria Mozart who survived to adulthood. Mozart, of course, famously died shortly before his 36th birthday. His sister would live all the way until the 1820s. She would live almost to the time of Beethoven's death. So she was around 80 years old. Now Mozart was, we really don't know much about him in these very early years, but we can imagine he was like most children. He learned to walk, he learned to talk, he learned to express himself. He developed his own personality, quirks, and idiosyncrasies. But it's at the age of 5 that he really lands himself a spot on the radar of music history, of all history, really. And that happened after a very particular moment where Leopold Mozart, the father, recorded the following. Nannerl, the sister, who was approximately 10 years old, concluded her piano lesson. And little Wolfie clambered up onto the piano bench. Actually, it would have been a harpsichord bench. This is the 1760s. The piano does not fully supplant the harpsichord really until the late 1770s or into the 1780s. And even in those decades, people are still playing harpsichords. But Leopold Mozart recorded the following. His son clambers up onto that bench and begins to play the keyboard. Not in the way that children usually play a keyboard. And those of you who have young children or grandchildren or neighbors' children, whoever it is, who comes over and you want to ward them away from your piano because all they seem to know how to do is smash. And yet Mozart didn't do that. He played coherently with 2 hands in complementary fashion, articulating the notes of a minuet that his sister had been playing just prior to that. Now, how is that possible? Well, Leopold Mozart thought it shouldn't be possible, and so he used a very specific word to describe Mozart. Ein Wunder, a wonder, or really the word Wunder in German is better translated in English as a miracle. Because, my friends, after all, what is a miracle? What happened if you read the Old Testament when, it's just Passover a couple of nights ago, many of you perhaps attended a Seder, when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt and parted the Red Sea, what happened? Walls of water stood on either side of the seabed? Well, that can't happen. It's impossible. And yet if you believe it, despite the fact that it's impossible, it happened. A miracle, by definition, is something which is impossible. And yet, it happens. That's how Leopold Mozart saw his son's manifestation of talent. It shouldn't be possible for a 5-year-old with no formal instruction to play coherently at the keyboard with both hands complementing one another. And yet it happened. Now this, of course, has been something that musicologists have wondered about, neuroscientists have wondered about it. Many of you perhaps are familiar with an author named Oliver Sacks. Since we're in a library, I'm obliged to plug a couple of books at least. Read Oliver Sacks' book, Musicophilia, about music and the brain. How many of us have heard the old axiom that human beings only use a fraction of our brain's potential? Perhaps no more than 10, 12, 15% of our brain's potential. The thinking is that in Mozart's brain, certain synapses were firing that are simply dormant in the average mortal. But Mozart had this gift. And he had no basis for comparison. He didn't know how to explain it. Ask someone, if you ever meet a person with perfect pitch, the ability to recognize tones out of thin air, someone who can listen to something and say, oh, that's in B flat major, or can listen to a tone and say, oh, that's an F sharp, without any reference point. Ask them how they do it. They can't explain it. They don't have any basis for comparison. So how was Mozart so gifted? We really don't know. We'd love to wonder and speculate, and there have been mountains of musicological papers and again, other academic disciplines that have delved into this. But the important thing is that he was different. And it's no surprise that in German, the word for a child prodigy, which you probably saw in the title of this lecture, is ein Wunderkind. A wonder child, a miracle child.
Yeah.
In English, we would say a child prodigy, but in German, Wunderkind. Don't we love German? How many of us feel that German, maybe it's time to rehabilitate the German language? I tell my students this all the time. German is a lovely language. Just look at the word for, say, daisy. The flowers, right? It's spring, feels springy outside. Daisy. In French, Marguerite. In German, Gänseblümchen. That's a cool one, right? The English word ambulance comes from the French ambulance. In German, ein Krankenwagen. Well, Mozart spoke German, but he also spoke many other languages. He was perfectly fluent, for example, in Italian. And those who heard him speak Italian remarked specifically upon his incredibly convincing accent. This ability to just sponge up the nuances of sound and articulation to speak in a non-native tongue with little or no accent. Mozart also was very facile in various dialects of German, and make no mistake about it, in a pre-modern world there were many different dialects of German, and Mozart, of course, was Austrian, so he knew Austrian dialects, as well as multiple Austrian dialects, as well as German dialects. He also knew Latin very well. His French was excellent. He even had a bit of English, although his grammar was not great. Anybody who's ever studied German will understand why. In German, you put the verb at the end of the sentence. And so Mozart, there's a surviving letter that he wrote to an English student named Thomas Atwood, who was a very promising young, also another Wunderkind who had been shipped off from England to study with Mozart. And Mozart was close to his death. He didn't know that, of course. And he left him a letter that said something like, do not to the house come. Because in German, you would put the verb at the end of the sentence. He says, I will not at the house until 11:15 B. Which if you speak German, you'll know that makes a whole lot of sense. All right, let's talk about some important musical traits. What can we expect from Mozart? We're going to look at three styles of Mozartian works tonight. We're going to first look at an early symphony from 1773, when Mozart was 17 years old. He wrote it. It was already his 25th symphony, by the way. We're then going to turn our attention to a concerto written in 1785 during Mozart's time in Vienna. And then we're going to finally conclude our program with a discussion of Mozart's Requiem, K626, the last piece in the Köchel catalog. Anton von Köchel was the guy who put Mozart's catalog together. And so sometimes when you look at Mozart's repertoire, it will say K575, and that just means it's Opus 575 in the catalog. Again, that musicologist's name was Anton von Köchel, a nice Irish guy. All right, some musical examples. How many of us remember our discussion of Bach? We talked about a concept known as polyphony, the idea that the voices, and they don't have to be human singing voices, they can be voices in the keyboard played by different hands or even different fingers, that those hands are independent. Remember we talked about this? We even looked at an example, I forget which one it was, I think it was the partita. Etc. All of that, we see the left hand has its own rhythm. It has its own independent contour. Sometimes it goes up when the right hand goes down, sometimes vice versa. Sometimes the right hand is moving in faster notes and the left hand is moving in slower notes. Very common in Bach. Ultimate example of polyphony would be imitative polyphony. Have a listen. If Mozart wouldn't necessarily embrace this style, but we'll see an example where he does at the end of the program. Most of the time, Mozart's style is going to be antithetical to what I'm about to play. Here's an example from a Bach invention. So we start. Hear that tune? Now listen to how it's imitated. you hear how different the different hands are moving, or how different their qualities are? But they're imitated. So one is chasing the other. Again, right? This one goes. So together. See that? There's a chase going on, right? We're not going to see that in Mozart. Why not? Because the style had changed. European audiences wanted something else. They didn't want those fugues like this one. We don't want that. What they want instead is simplicity. Melody that is hierarchically separated from harmony. And there's a clear pecking order. Melody is supreme. Harmony is ancillary. It's not as important. The job of the harmony is simply to support it. So instead of having independent voices like we have with Bach, instead what we're going to get is a very stratified style of music where melody is what the ear is drawn to. You can see this in any number of Mozart pieces, but here's an excerpt from a Mozart piano sonata that many of us are familiar with. Now it may seem that the left hand has its own rhythm, and it does, but if you listen closely, the left hand is just playing chords. That's all it's doing. In other words, what I'm playing here is doing something complex, but it's just playing chords, and those chords are being broken up into what we call an Alberti bass line. You simply take the chord, break it up into its notes. If it's C major, take a C, E, and a G, and just break it up and play it as eighth notes. But Mozart may as well have written this. Do you hear how the left hand there is really not saying anything independent? It's purely supporting the melody. And this is true in any number of Mozart sonatas. You see that? It's just... This is, by the way, from Mozart's Sonata K332. That's the F major sonata if anyone's looking for it. Mozart also was living in a time where music was phrased very evenly. That's not true in Bach, but it is true in Mozart. Have a listen. Here's a famous example of phrasing in a Mozart sonata. This is from K331, the famous theme and variations in A major. It starts like this. How many have heard this one? Very famous example. Notice it started again. But now it's different. Example of classical era, capital C, classical era phrasing. We start with what we call an antecedent phrase. And guess what comes after that? Start it again. It's going to be a mirror image now. Now, why were they writing in this style? Why did European ears crave this sound? Well, because Bach's music, that style of music, the fugues, for example, of the Baroque period, are demanding on the ears. We are not quite sure when we listen to a fugue what exactly we're supposed to be listening for. Our ear can get pulled in different directions. But with this new classical style, it's unambiguous. You're listening for the melody. And it doesn't matter, you can have a zooming bass line. Beethoven does these really fast bass lines. It sounds fancy, right? It's not. All he's doing, he's taking a chord, in this case G sharp minor, and it just... he might as well just do it, right? It sounds fancier than it is. It's a party trick. It's a nifty illusion on the ear. But music in this period is simpler. Categorically, not an opinion, it's an empirical fact to say that music of the classical period, generally speaking, is simpler than music of the Baroque period. Why? Because audiences craved simplicity. They wanted melody. They wanted something that they could easily, unambiguously follow. And Bach's music was not giving them that. In fact, Bach knew this at the end of his life, as we said in our previous program. He knew that his music was going out of style, and his response to the critics was to write a work known as Die Kunstwerk der Fuge, the art of the fugue. That was his sort of capstone project for his career, which he was writing at the time of his death. The art of the fugue, Die Kunst der Fuge, the art of the fugue. It was like a giant middle finger to the critics. You don't like fugues? Here's a compendium on every conceivable fugal device you can use within the context of a musical composition. And it's really remarkable. But Mozart grew up in a different era. And the Habsburg Empire ruled Austria, where Mozart lived. He was born in Salzburg, on the other side of Austria from Vienna, where he would eventually settle. They had been cultivating a kind of art that was bound up with a contemporaneous movement among artists and intellectuals and poets and thinkers that has the title in German, the Aufklaerung, or in English, the Enlightenment. And after all, think, what is the Enlightenment all about? Clarity. Nobility, not of birth, but nobility of thought. The ability to articulate an argument cogently and coherently. Well, doesn't that jive with everything we just talked about at the piano? That, for example, music should be organized in 8-bar phrases according to an antecedent and consequent model or some other model. That's elegant, isn't it? It's cogent, it's articulate, it's clear. Gone are the stained glass windows of the medieval period and the Renaissance, replaced here in the classical style of architecture by some of the biggest windows that were ever built. If you look at the buildings built in the late 18th century, they were built to admit as much light as possible. Because for the Enlightenment thinkers, this was literally letting the light in. And the music was thought to reflect those same principles. One other thing that's true of Mozart's music, although we're not going to see it tonight because we're going to be looking at very specific works that I've chosen that are outliers. But one thing that's interesting about Mozart's music, and this is true of much of the music in the Enlightenment era, is that an overwhelming amount of it is written in a major key. Now that might surprise you, but think about Mozart's catalog. There are 41 symphonies, 39 of which are in major, all but 2. There are 27 piano concerti, all but 2 are in major keys. 19 piano sonatas, all but 2 are in major keys. 5 violin concerti, all 5 are in major keys. And if you played Mozart in minor, it would sound very different. Now Mozart knew how to write in minor. We're going to look at some examples tonight. But if you take, for example, there it is transposed to C minor rather, ended on F minor. It doesn't quite sound the same, does it? The Enlightenment era composers favored the idea that major keys had a brilliance to them. That was, it lacked sort of what you might think of as the opacity confounding sound of the minor key, which left us in an emotional state at least, which maybe isn't fully resolved. Major keys, however, could be bright and sunny, and most of Mozart's works are in major keys. Again, 39 out of 41 symphonies, 25 out of 27 piano concerti, 5 out of 5 violin concerti, and the list goes on. That's not something that's exclusive to Mozart. That's true of Haydn as well. Haydn wrote 106 symphonies, 95 of which are in major keys. So, again, if you play any of those Mozart sonatas in a minor key, they sound very different, you know. And for my next trick, I'm going to play a Mozart in the style of Igor Stravinsky. Who are wondering, the left hand is in C sharp major. All I did was and I put the right hand back in C major. If I switch it, it sounds like this: left hand in C major, right hand in D flat. I'll be here until 8 o'clock. Thank you very much. All right. Let's talk about some repertoire. Mozart had an incredibly peripatetic youth. He traveled quite a bit. His father, Leopold, was an enterprising businessman and figured out that he could monetize the overwhelming abundance of talent that his 2 living children possessed. And so he put them out on the road. This started when Mozart was quite young, about 6.5 years old. So he and Nannerl hit the road with their papa. Mom stays at home, and off they go. Now, the Archbishop of Salzburg, where they lived, was actually very favorably inclined to sponsor these trips because he saw it as a way to spread the glory of Salzburg and his court, and maybe people would start to think of his court as a place where musicianship was especially fostered. Mozart spent his youth in various countries, all over Austria, of course, including audiences with some of the highest ranking nobility. He met the Empress Maria Theresa, for example, who was the mother of Joseph II, who became the Emperor of Austria in 1780 when Mozart eventually decides he was the catalyst for Mozart moving to Vienna. Mozart was about 25 years old, 26 years old. And of course, besides Austria, he travels to Germany, all over Germany, up to Berlin. He's in Mannheim, he's in Bavaria, he goes all over the place. The family, during these trips, which were sort of mapped out by Leopold, were intended to make money, and they made a lot of money. If the average salary that Mozart would collect in his life was, even at the end of his life, Mozart was getting paid 400 or 500 florins a year, the sum total that was earned by the Mozarts during these trips, I should say, because there were many of them that lasted nearly a decade, was close to 10,000 florins. So this was equivalent to, maybe twice what Mozart earned in salary per year at the highest point in his career. Now, it's often said that Mozart was poor at the end of his life, and that's not untrue, but it's often exaggerated. The truth is, had Mozart lived another few years, he would have not only recovered and paid off his debts, he probably would have lived to be very wealthy. His fortune was really reversing in 1791, but as we say, the rest is history. We know that he contracted a mysterious illness in late November, or perhaps earlier. That's part of the mystery. We'll get there. And he just got sick, went to sleep, and never woke up. Now, what kind of music did Mozart write while he was on the road? He didn't. You'd think he would be so busy entertaining these various aristocrats and high-ranking figures in European society. How would he have time to write? But write he did, my friends. He was a prolific writer at this time. He wrote in all genres of the day, including minuets, string quartets, piano sonatas, all sorts of piano miniatures. He even wrote operas. In fact, the opera that he wrote just prior to the completion of this symphony is an opera that Mozart wrote when he was 16 called Lucia Silla. And these were operas that weren't just some abstraction on a page. These got actual performances. So, Mozart, you can probably see here, this is Symphony number 25 in G minor. Mozart wrote this when he was 17 years old. So this was written in 1773. Mozart born in 1756, same year as Alexander Hamilton, by the way. It starts in G minor with what we would call a very heavily syncopated melody. So if this is the beat, melody goes like this. Again, if I'm counting here, my left hand's keeping the beat, my right hand's articulating the rhythm. This heavily articulated style, combined with the fact that it's in a minor key, is associated with a contemporaneous style of art that we find not only in music but also in literature, known as the Sturm und Drang style. Sturm and Drang, as they say in English. Sturm und Drang means storm and sometimes translated as storm and stress. That's not quite right. Storm and swell would probably be a better rendering of the German. But there are any number of examples of Sturm und Drang, and this is a very famous one in Mozart's repertoire. Mozart may have been influenced in his writing of the symphony by a symphony by Haydn that had been written earlier in the decade, and that's Symphony number 39, also in the key of G minor, also written in the Sturm und Drang style. Now this opening movement has a couple of hallmark features that we can expect in a classical era symphony. First and foremost, we've got two contrasting themes. And there are many things to listen for in a symphony, but for this evening, because of the limited scope of our time, I'm going to suggest that we just listen for the two contrasting themes which are at the core of any first movement, basically, in the classical literature. Let's listen. Second theme. Here it's different now. Major key. Notice it repeats then. In the classical period, they wove a lot of repeats into the music. And this is for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, in an era before recording technology, if you repeat the music, then you, the listener, are more likely to retain the imprint of that music in your hippocampus. You're more likely to remember the tunes. So they're suffused with repeats. Now here we have the two themes. That syncopated theme we talked about, and then we have and notice how contrasting they are. The first one syncopated, what we would call a kind of jagged melody in terms of its intervals. The second one, just starting with a simple octave. So these, you listen to a symphony and you might think, well, what am I supposed to listen to? If I listen to a Mozart symphony, there's 41 symphonies. in the Köchel catalog. There's 106 in the Haydn catalog. What am I supposed to listen to? I feel adrift. I would say you can learn a lot about these symphonies just with your ears. Listen for the contrasting themes. Listen for not only contrasting in terms of tonality, the first theme here in G minor, the second in B flat major, but also contrasting in rhythm, contrasting in contour. And if you can wrap your ear around that, which almost anybody can, you can start to appreciate aspects of these symphonies. And if you look at music and you think, what is it that makes music compelling to us as listeners? Oftentimes it's familiarity, it's the ability to connect with something that we recognize, right? And so hearing, for example, the first and second themes, which are, as I mentioned, pretty much ubiquitous in classical era symphonic first movements, I think it's easy to appreciate at least one aspect of the architecture of a symphony. Now, I chose this symphony for a couple of reasons. One, because it's emblematic of this Sturm und Drang style. But the other reason is because, for those of you who remember the movie Amadeus, this is the music that the producers chose to be featured in the opening scene where Salieri has his nervous breakdown and is committed to the asylum. So it's wonderful for capturing the frenetic and tortured mind of an aging Antonio Salieri as he's coming to grips with his own increasing irrelevance and the mental damage that this inflicts on him as he's heading for the loony bin. And let me just suggest, nowadays we're a society that is much more sensitive towards mental illness. They were not in the 18th century or the 19th century. And so that depiction of Salieri's fate at the end of the movie is probably not dissimilar from what the man was actually subjected to. Even, 30 years later, when Robert Schumann died in 1856, he too suffered for 2.5 years wasting away in an asylum. But the fate of Robert Schumann, Elaine, that's a story for another day. We'll talk about Robert Schumann. All right, let's talk now about the piano concerto. Mozart was a prolific composer of piano concerti. He wrote them, of course, sometimes for students. He had very prominent students, very wealthy students, and very talented students who could play these pieces. Sometimes he wrote them as star vehicles for himself. And that was the case with this next piano concerto we're going to look at, which is number 20, once again, in a minor key in D minor. And you'll see why I'm choosing minor key pieces as we get to the end of the program. Mozart had written a variety of piano concertos. So when I say that, I mean that not all of them behave in predictable ways. Number 9 is a good example. The so-called Gename concerto, written for Madame Gename, one of Mozart's aristocratic students. That's the E-flat concerto. It doesn't begin the way we expect a concerto to begin. This one has a more traditional beginning, so it's a good way to wrap our ears around the concerto style, at least one element. Just as we did with the symphony, where we tried to wrap our ears around both the first and second themes and the division between them, we're going to learn a little bit about the concerto form today. The word concerto comes from the Latin concertare. It means to oppose. So built into any musical concerto is the idea of opposition. In this case, of course, opposition is between the soloist, Mozart at the piano, for example, and the orchestra, which is sometimes going to play without the piano, sometimes with the piano, and often in sort of dialogue with the piano, you might say. Now, where was Mozart living when he wrote this? For the last 10 years or so of his life, Mozart lived not in Salzburg, his hometown, which, by the way, he hated. Many people, I suppose, grow up with the impulse to leave the town that they grew up in. I certainly did. I grew up in Queens, New York, and I have no desire to ever return to Queens, New York. My students ask me, Professor, what was it like to grow up in Queens? And I say, Queens is a great place to visit. Sporadically. Very sporadically. Of course, now that I live in the promised land of Connecticut, I hope my children will want to stay here because it's great. But Mozart hated Salzburg. He hated it for a host of reasons, probably first and foremost because his father lived in Salzburg. Mozart had daddy issues, you might say. But also Salzburg lacked something that was very important to Mozart, and that was opera. Now, we're not going to get to opera this evening. That would be opening up Die Büchse der Pandora. That would be opening Pandora's box, and we simply don't have enough time to adequately shoehorn operatic repertoire into tonight's program. So we can leave that for perhaps a future program. But Mozart, he loved opera, and there was no opera in Salzburg. Moreover, the boss in Salzburg was a guy named Hieronymus Colloredo, the Archbishop, the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg. And he was not someone who was favorably inclined towards the Mozart family. And so for those reasons, Mozart wanted to get the heck out of Salzburg. And finally, he saw his opportunity in the early 1780s when he attended the coronation of the new Emperor of Austria after the death of Maria Theresa. The new emperor was Joseph II. Ironically, Mozart would outlive him. Joseph II died in 1790 on a campaign against the Turks. He died of malaria. Yeah. He's played in the movie Amadeus by an actor named Jeffrey Jones, and probably his most famous line in the movie is he sort of dismissively waves his hand and says, "Well, there it is." If you watch the movie Amadeus, you'll notice the emperor is a very funny character. Bumbling and incompetent, but well-meaning. Mozart loved the city of Vienna. As soon as he went there, he loved it. And he contrived a way to remain there. Now, how do you do that? It's a tricky conundrum. If you work for the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg, what do you say? "Well, Your Grace, I think I just want to stay here. I want to go back to Salzburg." You can't do that. So Mozart contrived to get himself fired. Mostly through just being impudent, that is to say, being rude. And eventually he was dismissed from the service of the Archbishop, literally with a kick to the posterior. The steward for the Prince Archbishop was a guy named Count Arco. And Mozart related to his father, he said, "He dismissed me from service with a kick to the rump." So there you have it. Mozart's now a free man. Now what do you do if you're all of a sudden a 25-year-old musician in Vienna? What do you do? That's tricky, isn't it? Well, Mozart worked more or less for the rest of his life, which would only be another 10 years, as a freelance musician. And that meant that he composed. Sometimes there was a guaranteed honorarium on the other side of that, sometimes not. Sometimes he was hoping for one, and sometimes he would swing and he would miss, just as Bach did, for example, with the Brandenburg Concerto. Remember we talked about that in the last program? He wrote them for the Margrave of Brandenburg, Christian Ludwig, and was never able to experience any tangible reward. Of course, posterity has been rewarded by Bach for the composition of those concerti, but Bach didn't receive anything. Gar nicht, as they say in German. Fast forward to Mozart, and he's going to write various concerti, and he's going to stage concerts and sell tickets. And that's kind of an interesting phenomenon because it testifies to the fact that the times were changing, and all of a sudden the idea of buying a ticket with one's disposable income and going to a concert was a real thing that was happening in Vienna. And in France, all over France, for example, especially in Paris and in London, in the big cities in Europe and Berlin. Certainly in Italy it was happening. And it's a new thing that started in the 1760s or so. Again, this idea of paid subscription ticket concerts, where you, the composer, could collect a certain share of the ticket sales by featuring your music. That was not on the table for a guy like Bach, for example, or for Josquin des Prez in the Renaissance, or for Palestrina or William Byrd. The idea of public concerts where you buy a ticket, there's no middle class to buy tickets back then. So I think if you are going to take something away from this lecture beyond the music, think about we talked about the Aufklaerung, the Enlightenment, the rise of the middle class, this idea of consuming music in a public venue, which we think of as just part of the culture, right? Well, that started in Mozart's youth. That's a remarkable thing. It's not often discussed, but it's part of the seismic shifts that are taking place in the late 18th century. Now, this particular concerto is in the key of D minor, and that makes it interesting. I'll tell you a couple stories about this before we listen to just a little tidbit of it. Mozart did not write often in minor keys, as we said, but he wrote this one in minor key, and it's perhaps not surprising that later generations of composers would declare this concerto the greatest of the Mozart concerti. Beethoven, for example, was very open about how this was his most favorite and the most inspirational of the Mozart concerti. Mozart wrote it for a public performance which took place in 1785. He himself was the soloist, and this gives me an opportunity to share a wonderful anecdote about the concerto. Mozart, in typical fashion, because he wrote so prolifically and so quickly, was busy copying out what we call the fair score. He's taking the master score and he's making all the parts so that the violinist, the bassoonist, the oboist, everybody has their music. The problem is he didn't have enough time to copy out all the parts. literally on the morning of the performance, he was finishing copying orchestral parts for the third movement, and he didn't have time to finish the piano part. So what do you think he did? He just went out there and played it from a combination of memory and improvisation. Now, it's one thing to improvise in the jazz world over a fixed chord progression. It's another to improvise within the context of a classical concerto, which requires, as many of you know, a very specific execution of very specific notes that fit very specific patterns. And it's not something that you can just sort of, most people would think of being able to improvise. Mozart more or less improvised it, we think. It was very favorably received. Mozart was very fortunate, or maybe unfortunate in this case, because his dad was in town. Leopold came, and this would be the last time they saw each other, Leopold's visit in this period. But Leopold attended the concert, and we know that he loved it because he wrote back to Mozart's sister, Nannerl, and he said, "I just attended a concert where your brother premiered a new piano concerto. Brilliant!" And he executed flawlessly. Not bad. Well done, Wolfie. Now, one thing that wasn't well received, you'll see the soloist in this performance, a very controversial figure, but kind of brilliant. Her name is Valentina Lisitsia, a Ukrainian pianist, and she's controversial. It turned out, as some of you know, she made a name for herself 10 years ago on YouTube. She's one of these pianists who has taken a rather unconventional route to stardom. Why? Well, because conventionally you would go to college and conservatory, maybe graduate program, and if you're really good, you'd give recitals, and hopefully you'd get noticed, and then maybe you'd have an opportunity to play at a competition or at a summer festival, Aspen or Tanglewood or something like that, and you'd eventually climb the ranks until a record company took interest in you, and then you get a record deal, and then you could sell records and make money like that. But 10 or 15 years ago, that changed. The monetization model for performing musicians changed, and you have musicians who are able to circumvent that traditional route and just make a name for themselves on YouTube and make a living through ad revenue. And she's really good. She specializes in romantic repertoire, but maybe 5 or 6 years ago, she courted controversy through some comments she made on Twitter. Does that sound, who would have imagined such a thing, right? But it turned out that she was sent to play a concerto with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, and then they unearthed some tweets where basically she declared herself, now this is, let's say 6 years ago, she declared herself to be a Ukrainian pro-Russian separatist. So talk about, talk about crazy timing. Anyway, she's still, I would suggest, one of the more popular pianists on YouTube. If you Google search conventional piano repertoire, famous staples in the piano repertoire, whether it's a Beethoven sonata or Rachmaninoff, Opus 23, number 5, or the C-sharp minor prelude, or an impromptu by Schubert. If you just Google something like that, her videos will be some of the first to come up. So here she is playing a little bit of this concerto, and this is, you can see here, the Freiburg Orchestra's very well-known orchestra. Leitung means director. Second theme. Hear it? Contrasting, right? It's in now. What have we not heard?
Yeah.
Piano. So this is one of the hallmarks of the concerto format, the solo concerto of the late 18th century. Starts with what we call a double exposition form. What that means is the first thing you're going to hear are the two themes. We just talked about the binary themes that we get in a concerto, in a symphony, a string quartet, piano sonata. But because you want to save the sound of the soloist so that they make a splash, as it were, what you'll often find in the vast majority of solo concerti is that the soloist does not actually play for the first couple of minutes. You introduce the themes, and then they're going to be recapitulated or played again, this time with the soloist, or mostly by the soloist, but with significant embellishment. So let's listen. Second theme. Hear it? I encourage you to listen to the rest of this concerto on your own time. We're going to move on now, but things to take away here is that the concerto is very similar in format to a symphony. It starts the presentation of two contrasting themes, contrasting here meaning in different keys, but also often having different directionality or contour. But the difference is, in a concerto, you don't normally hear the soloist enter at the very beginning. Typically their entrance is reserved for after those two themes have already been stated. Ergo, the double exposition. Symphonies start with an exposition, concertos a double exposition. And if you listen to this concerto, you'll see, especially when we get to the cadenza at the end of the first movement, it very much anticipates some of the stylistic traits of the Romantic period, the period that's going to be associated with Beethoven. And we're going to talk all about him in May, of course. Now, how did Mozart fare as a composer of concerti? Well, this was a source of income for him, but it wasn't a big one, and so it's perhaps not surprising that Mozart, as prolific as he was with symphonic repertoire and concerto repertoire, he didn't often make a ton of money from these ventures. And there's no better example of that than his final three symphonies, numbers 39, 40, and 41, which he wrote in the summer of 1788, and he was hoping to stage them in the fall and receive large amounts of money, and he didn't get much. Didn't get any performances, didn't get any money. So you could write these massive pieces and still not benefit in a tangible way, at least. And that's a sad reality for a freelance musician living in Vienna in the late 18th century. Mozart was a great fan of Vienna when he first arrived there, but he became disenchanted with the city later in his stay. And of course, by the end of his time in Vienna, where he's going to die, his fortune was turning around. When he was turning around, he had written a number of very important works in his last year, 1791. Remember, Mozart dies at the very end of 1791. It's December 5th is the day of his death. What are some of these works? Let me give you a few examples. In September, he premieres a very important work in the repertoire. It's kind of like an opera, but it's technically called a Singspiel. I'm talking, of course, about the magic flute, die Zauberflöte. Very good. Mozart also wrote a very important concerto that took advantage of a new instrument that was brand spanking new at the time. It's the first of its kind. A concerto written for which instrument? The bassoon. Vivaldi had written plenty of bassoon concerti. The clarinet. That was written for a fellow Freemason, a guy by the name of Anton Stadler, who was Mozart loved him, but the guy was a real knave, a real scallywag. Love that word. Real word, real word. There's a period where Stadler, the clarinetist, was kicked out of his apartment and he went to live with the Mozarts, and he was sleeping on the Mozart's couch for a week. Finally, Constanza, Mozart's wife, said, either he leaves or I leave. All right, that takes us to the last piece Mozart was working on. Now we could have not one, we could have multiple programs just on the Requiem, but I've chosen to end with the Requiem so we can look at a very curious phenomenon that takes place within the Requiem, and it's reflective of a general trend that we see in many composers who, when writing what they perceive to be an important, historically important capstone-style work, they will often turn their attention back to previous generations, to previous styles, and conjure up a style that perhaps had been long out of fashion, and that's the case for Mozart. He wrote the Requiem on a commission by an anonymous individual, turned out to be a minor aristocrat. Now, in the movie, who commissions the Requiem? Salieri, right? Now, do you think Salieri was the real commissioner of the Requiem? No, he was not. But it makes for a good story. You know, I have been known, my mother says anyway, that I was known as a child to embellish stories. Mom, my brother almost killed me. Well, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. That's certainly the ethos in Hollywood, and so it makes a really compelling story in the movie that Salieri would be the guy. It wasn't him. Turned out to be a minor lordling by the name of Count Johann von Walsegg. Walsegg was a cellist and a mediocre musician who loved nothing more than commissioning works, taking them, copying out in his own hand, and putting his name on it. That was probably his plan with the Requiem, but he never got to do it because Mozart, of course, died prematurely. But Mozart's working on this Requiem, and it opens, as Requiems do, with the text of the Kyrie. Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison. Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. Mozart writes a big double fugue on these words. Let's go ahead and listen to it. We'll just listen to a little bit of this. Start the bass, and the alto answers. first movement, Mozart, of course, as some of you know, did not finish the Requiem. He began writing the Lacrimosa, the seventh movement, and that was when he finally took to his bed. There's a wonderful story about Mozart. He had some of his friends over, musicians, and he wanted to sort of show them what he had completed in the Requiem. These are all really good musicians, so they're singing and playing at the piano, and Mozart himself was supposedly reading one of the alto parts. And they're going off and reading this, and Mozart all of a sudden he yelled at his friends who were visiting him, and he says, "Stop, stop, wait, wait." He looked at his watch and he said, "The Queen of the Night should be taking the high F right around now." He was talking about a performance of the Magic Flute that was happening across town. A window into the mind of Mozart. Imagine him, sick and frail, and all of a sudden he has to press pause because there's a performance of the Magic Flute going on around town, and he's wondering about that famous high F. That takes place in the Queen of the Night's aria, Der Hölle Rache kocht in meinem Herzen. Hell's vengeance boils in my heart. Very famous soprano aria. Not for the faint of heart, for sopranos who want to try singing it. Very few sopranos who can really get up into that register to sing the F6. And Mozart knew it. But he wrote that part for his sister-in-law. In the movie, there's a great scene where they show his mother-in-law screaming at him, haranguing him, and then that transitions to the Queen of the Night singing the cartoon China. As tempting as it would be to believe it, it wasn't the mother-in-law who inspired him, it was his sister-in-law. Famous soprano by the name of Josefa Weber, who married a guy named Hofer, so she became Josefa Hofer, had a very successful opera career. But the reason we end with the Requiem is to see, not only do we have another work in a minor key, as we said, it's very unusual for Mozart. Now that's significant because when we get to the Romantic period, some of the most important works of the Romantic period are written in minor keys. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the Tempest Sonata, the Opus 111 C minor Sonata, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is in C minor, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is in D minor. It goes on and on. And his Opus 131 String Quartet in C sharp minor, his Opus 132 String Quartet in A minor. Minor keys are going to be all the rage. So even though we don't think of him as someone who portends the future, Mozart's embrace of minor keys in critical pieces in his career is a sort of portal into the future. The other thing is that Mozart writes this very heavy contrapuntal piece here. And I would suggest that that's noteworthy because, as we said at the beginning of the program when I was over at the piano, generally speaking, composers of the Aufklaerung, of the Enlightenment, rejected the style of Bach. They rejected polyphony, they rejected fugue. And here Mozart shows that he could fugue with the best of them. He had learned about fugues from various sources, but he really discovered Bach's music thanks to the court librarian at the imperial court of Emperor Joseph. His name was Baron Gottfried von Swieten, and he ended with a great, I'll end tonight's program with a great quote from that meeting. The story goes that Mozart was sitting at the harpsichord reading motet parts, so single parts in different scores, and he's reading them all at the same time because he's Mozart, and you could sight read that. And he paused after a few measures, and he turned to the man who had introduced him to all of this, the court librarian. His name was Baron Gottfried von Swieten. Mozart turns to von Swieten and he says, and this will connect us back to our first program and also help us anticipate our next program. He says to von Swieten, "Now this is something we can all learn from." And he incorporated, of course, into what would be his last work. Of course, he didn't know that when he wrote it, but it wound up being so. So thank you, my friends, for attending this program.